This episode of Holding the Line contains descriptions and discussions of sensitive topics and violence. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Holding the Line, a podcast about cops, courts, and crime. I am Jason Johnson, co host of this podcast and also president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. I'm joined by Sean Kennedy, who will be also co hosting. Sean, what's this podcast going to be like?
Well, it's hopefully going to bring some light to so many of the issues that are affecting both policing and the criminal justice system in the present and illuminate what has brought us to this point. And throughout that journey, we're going to have a number of guests, including current and retired senior and even frontline law enforcement, people who are in the criminal justice system, prosecutors, experts, and analysts, even media personalities that have insight into what's going on in specific cases, some of the cases that Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund works on, and on high profile cases across the country. And in many cases, cases that you've never heard of that really matter. So we're going to bring a policing perspective, a law enforcement and legal perspective. My colleague and co host Jason actually is a lawyer as well as being a law enforcement leader for decades. And we will bring in analysis and data so you understand what's behind the scenes and what's going on the TV screen is something that's real and has both dysfunction and purpose. And we'll hopefully lay that out for you and every week bring you something new to think about and to engage with.
And Sean, since after all, this is a product of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, which has been for over 30 years a leader in law enforcement advocacy, and in particular in selecting cases in which law enforcement officers have been singled out for prosecution unfairly and, oftentimes for political reasons. We're going to talk about that too. We will talk about those cases. We'll talk about what's in the news that impacts law enforcement in particular, but also, for example, we've written and talked a lot in the past about progressive prosecutors. The work of these prosecutors has such a negative impact on the law enforcement community. And so these things, they're nuanced. You can't, if you just watch the news cycle, you see this is right, this is wrong, and it's not always clear why. And it's really something that needs to be debated. And this is actually the perfect forum to do that. So really the first thing I think we need to do is to just talk about the modern history of what is often called the war on cops.
When do you think this both the term but the real timeline starts? Because everybody talks about the war on cops today, and we know what it looks like in reality in the here and now. But when did it really get started?
So obviously there have been throughout history moments where society kind of turned against law enforcement. I mean, look in the 60s, that was probably a big period of time there where that was the case. But throughout, most of the 70s, 80s, and the 90s, crime was more of a concern for people, so they were more supportive of law enforcement and so on. But I think when we talk about the modern era, quote unquote, war on cops, really we trace it back to the beginning of the Obama administration. And everyone can remember this incident, a young police officer or sergeant, I think, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, arrested a Harvard professor, Henry Louis Gates. And it was early in the Obama administration, and President Obama was friends with Professor Gates. And after this incident happened, it gained a lot of media attention. President Obama called a beer summit. This was after Obama had condemned what the officer did without all the information. So this was a very high profile example of judging what the cops had done without actually knowing the facts. And President Obama kind of stepped in it, and he realized it within a couple of days. So he said, oh, actually, we just need to invite everyone to the White House. And I think that's where it sort of started. And then, there have been so many things along the way. I think about Freddie Gray, in Baltimore, where I wound up serving for a few years in the aftermath of this. It was a huge, some people call it riot, some people call it uprising, but there was buildings burning to the ground and people in the streets throwing rocks and bottles at the cops. And then that has happened repeatedly over the years since then. And so that is when we talk about war on cops, that's what we talk about. We also are talking about, Sean, things like where prosecutors target cops and they prosecute them just because they're cops. In some cases, elected just to do that. And you have written extensively about that. So that's a huge part of the conversation as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing that I think you mentioned that really why the beer summit matters so much was not the photo op of them sitting in the south lawn of the White House, at some picnic table having a beer. But that was followed very quickly thereafter by the Trayvon Martin killing. And in Trayvon Martin's case, what is so disturbing, and this goes to the beer summit, Obama jumping to conclusions, is that it somehow has been conflated that the man who killed Martin was a cop. And he wasn't. And in fact, the police dispatch told him not to pursue this kid.
Mm.
And so this somehow became part of the Black Lives Matter movement, the proto Black Lives Matter movement. Then you get to Ferguson, where it's one of these other rush to judgments. And they burned Ferguson to the ground.
Well, in that case, it just Sean, in the Ferguson case, isn't it true that the whole hands up, don't shoot thing actually didn't happen?
Well, and that's the whole thing, is that all these narratives are burned into our psyche, our collective memory, and so many of them are just made up. They're totally out of the whole cloth, but they can never be undone, and that's the problem, and I think that's sort of the purpose here, why we're talking about the war on cops, and what we will bring with this podcast is there's more to the story. There are more facts behind the image that you see on CNN. The joke is the newspaper is the first draft of history, but nobody ever goes back and edits that history. And so the average American reads that first draft and says, oh, that must be the case. But this autopsy that comes out, or this recreation, or the decision by the prosecutors later to drop the charges just gets ignored. It's on page A29, not page A1. So whatever was on page A1 3 weeks ago is what people believe. And they do poll after poll about issues across the country, and they ask people about a narrative, not just about policing. And 60 to 70% of Americans believe in a false narrative if it was the first narrative, because
Mhm.
they just tune out and then they don't revise their opinion. And when it comes to policing, it's especially susceptible to this. And so first impressions are the only
Yeah.
impression. And we're left with these myths about policing that pervade our public discussion. Nobody is willing or is able to stand up to them because the Washington Post said so, the New York Times said so, or CBS said so. It must be true. And that's where we are.
Absolutely. Frankly, that's a lot of what we do as an organization anyway, is we try to dispel those myths and clear up those misconceptions all the way back to Ferguson and Michael Brown, of trying to bring greater awareness to the fact that Obama's own Department of Justice looked into it and said, no, nothing wrong happened. And in fact, the whole hands up narrative was false. And the media, ignored it. And that's really what has been missing in the conversation around policing in particular. It's not unique to policing, but it just seems like it's hit so hard in the law enforcement area and people who are in law enforcement. This is what really bothers them every day is they read the newspaper, they watch the news, they have, in some cases, firsthand knowledge of a particular incident. And then they read how it's reported in the media, and it's like, no, that's wrong. That's not even close to what happened. And because the media accounts tear at the fabric of what their profession is, people leave law enforcement for that reason, because they go to a family cookout and they're confronted with people who think they know better and are telling them stuff that's like, no, that's not true. Check your facts. And that has become a big problem, and it really, has been a big part of why law enforcement is a profession that is not in demand by young people. They're not pursuing law enforcement careers the way they used to. Just about 30 years ago when I started my law enforcement, I felt like everybody wanted to be a cop. When you go take the, initial test to be a cop, there's like a line around the block. Everybody wanted the job, and you're competing for the job against lots and lots of people. They didn't have to offer signing bonuses or anything else to get you to take the job. People wanted the job, because they wanted to do something good for their community. And for other reasons, I'm sure, but I mean, that was the main driver. It wasn't for money or anything. Now, people don't want the job anymore because they don't want to be thought of, in a negative light. And that's the way the perception of policing has changed. And that, frankly, that's dangerous. I mean, if the only downside of that was that, well, you got to pay people more money to be cops now, okay, fine. But it's more than that. I mean, what motivated people to enter the profession is going to tell the story about how they're going to approach their work. If you do any job because you feel intrinsic motivation to do it as a good thing, you're going to do better than just, well, they got the highest signing bonus, so I'm going to go do that. Or they have good benefits or whatever. Or worse, I want the job because I want to exercise my authority.
Well, I mean, the way that you could use phrases, being a police officer is a vocation. You sign up as a career with purpose. It's not just a career because you're pushing paper at, some big corporation. You're doing something because you have purpose and you're committed to that vocation and you will do it for a career. Very few people join the force saying Audi 5000 at 5 years or
Yeah.
whatever. And so when people leave early or don't impart their knowledge to the next generation, you get this brain drain. And we're seeing this with attrition with a lot of guys saying, I hit my retirement,
Mm.
I'm out of here. And then to your point about people joining is in the 90s when you saw these lines down the block to join LAPD, NYPD, police forces across the country, you get to be selective. "Oh, yeah, I don't, you're not good enough on the test or you can't meet the physical fitness standards or whatnot. And they were having huge cutoffs about you had to have 90 percentile or whatever. Man, you're getting the cream of the crop because you have 100 guys for every spot. Now they're going out going, would you like $50,000? Oh, and then taking it a step further and lowering the fitness standards, allowing, excessive tattoos or piercings or beards or whatever.
That's easy.
Marijuana. I mean, at what point does a guy who smokes marijuana go make an arrest for marijuana and feel like, oh, this is totally
I don't
legit?
think you could arrest for marijuana anymore.
Well, I mean, some places, but I mean, if you had enough of it, this guy's got a kilo of marijuana in his trunk.
Yeah.
I've got a kilo at home. What am I going to do with all this stuff? And that lowering of standards is going to do something wild that I think we're starting to already see it. And we wrote about this in the Memphis case. It's going to make this false narrative that the cops are wild, violent, brutal, incompetent
Come true.
come true.
Yes.
You're bringing it to fruition by bringing in people who aren't, ready for prime
Yeah.
time to do this.
I don't know what the goal has been for like this constant pressure, all of the actions that have been taken to make the profession of law enforcement less appealing. I don't know what the end goal of that is, but the way it's playing itself out is exactly what we've said is many, and I won't say all agencies, because some agencies have done a good job locally making sure they recruit, still have a good pool of candidates. So it's not universal, but by and large, it's been changing the dynamics between getting the cream of the crop beating down your door to going out and chasing down marginally good applicants at best. So that's not good for anyone. I don't care who you are. We want to see the best. We want to see not only the best, but the best trained, the best performing, constitutional policing. That's what we're after. We're not after anything else. And just sort of all of the dynamics that we've talked about have led I think in many cases in the other direction. And that's the bottom
And
line.
excellence in law enforcement, both in the quality of officers and training quality, is only going to improve relationships in these communities because they are treated as professionals because they are professionals. And any way you degrade them both verbally or physically, you're demotivating people to do their job. They're debilitating, demoralizing them. And then it has a knock on effect. Even if you are a great officer and you're fit and you're smart and you're all these things, and the people on the street don't want you out there or the powers that be aren't supporting you when it comes to it. I'm not saying you're going to phone it in, but you're not quite as motivated to go the extra mile. And certainly in the cases of some of these prosecutions where they see their colleagues get jammed up on some bogus charge or an assault or this or whatever, they're going to hold back. And when that happens, cops are less heroes than bystanders. And I'm not, injecting on it because I don't have the facts, importantly. But what was the perception in Uvalde and at Parkland, the shootings, the cops didn't step up. They didn't
Yeah.
put their own lives on the line. And both of them got prosecuted and both of them got acquitted. But as an emotional thing for anyone to see a dangerous situation go south and the cop was not engaging, it makes your heart sink.
Well,
Because cops
perception is
do that.
terrible.
But 99.9% of the chances of situations, cops do inject themselves and go put their life and limb on the line. And that's just ignored.
One of the reasons it was so shocking is it's just not something we've ever seen before. Certainly not something as dramatic as an active shooter. We, for years, have trained cops to go in, and that's what you actually signed up for. I was in law enforcement when this whole active shooter thing started, and the training changed. And cops at first, so standard police training is like, no, you stay outside and you try to like negotiate basically from cover.
Like a hostage
Like that,
situation.
like treat it like a hostage situation. And this was a new thing that everybody was adjusting to. So particularly after this really started to happen, police training radically changed. And they actually literally put us into training scenarios. This is how we handle active shooters. You get there, you hear gunfire, you get a small team together, and you go in. And your goal is to find the shooter and to stop the threat.
And there was an incident in North Texas at a mall recently were a crazy guy, just like this
Yeah.
guy in Uvalde, and the cops went right
Yeah,
in.
that's what they
The
do.
first thing they did is roll up, grab their, M4s or AR-15s out of the trunk, and they hunted this guy, and they
Yeah,
killed him within
and that's
minutes.
exactly what cops are trained to do, and so that was why it was so shocking Uvalde that it didn't seem to happen that way, and it cost lives of kids in a school, so it was just completely shocking to the conscience, and so, because it's rare. Obviously, the concern is maybe not for an active shooter situation, but in everyday street policing situations is that cops are being actually incentivized not to get as involved as they may have in the past because it's so much of a risk, not a risk to safety of the officer necessarily, but it's a legal risk or it's a risk that, well, if I go out there and I'm not talking about interrupting a shooting in progress or anything dramatic like that, but if you're a cop on the beat and you see somebody that seems to be suspicious and you can actually articulate reasons why you think they may be involved in crime or they may be armed. In the past, cops were trained and incentivized and motivated to go intervene to stop people when they can legally do it. And now I just see the opposite, where it's like, well, I'm going to get second guessed. What if I approach this person and they resist? Am I covered to overcome their resistance by using some level of force, even just to detain them? What if I get out and they want to fight me and I have to use force? Or what if they have a weapon and I have to use deadly force? How am I going to be judged? Am I going to be prosecuted? Am I going to get fired? What is it gonna say about me in the newspaper? And, those are the things that are going through cops' minds today, and I don't think the public fully understand it or can empathize in any way with it. So, here we are talking about it
Yeah,
and gaining an understanding about it.
and that's the point here is that there is a whole series of myths and perceptions about policing and crime and public safety and what all these systems do to work together. And the meta narrative is that you may not know the whole story. Actually, there's people on the ground who are there who do know a great deal of the story, but it's the old Paul Harvey line.
And now, the rest of the story.
Rest of the story seems to always get erased. And that's really this with policing, it's especially egregious, and with crime is we tell a narrative and then we move right along. And so just the last couple of days, there's been some reporting on the dramatic drop in homicides in big cities. But why they're dropping and how they're dropping and what role policing has in that is not being told. People think magic fairy dust is being spread over Philadelphia right now. No, Philadelphia's cops are back out on the street because the mayor hired a police chief who's not messing
Yeah,
around.
he's backing them up,
Yeah.
supporting the troops, if you will. So we've touched on, the basic what is called the war on cops. Some people don't even like that term. That's fine, but it's essentially that's what it is. It's not a literal war. It's a cold war, if you will. It has to do with policy and politicians' decisions and how the media covers them. And sometimes it is a literal war on cops, where because of all that, a couple of cops are sitting having lunch together and somebody walks in and catches them off guard and assassinates them. That happens. And that is like the literal war on cops. It's a reaction to the narrative, which is what we really have a problem with. But so we're going to talk about all of those things and more. Politics around criminal justice, things like these prosecutors who have been elected and things about, like qualified immunity, which it's a buzzword that people like to hate and certain elements of the political spectrum and academics and media attack qualified immunity, but they don't actually tell the story about what it is.
For the listeners who are new to this, qualified immunity effectively is a legal doctrine that gives some protection to police for actions done in the line of duty. But this goes back to what we've been talking about and what qualified immunity is part of. Qualified immunity is, do you have backing? Is it from your chief, from the prosecutor, from your sergeant, or whoever? Are you protected enough to do your job? Because policing takes risks. You're making calculated risk decisions at every moment. If your risk calculus is now, am I going to go to prison or be sued, until I live on the streets? You're going to make a different risk calculus than if otherwise. And by stripping qualified immunity, which a number of states have tried to do or mitigated, and currently Virginia just introduced it in the General Assembly to do just that. So that would be another state where they would take away protections from police to do their jobs.
You are a law enforcement officer. You are making decisions nonstop throughout your workday about risk management. Okay. And some of those risk management decisions are, am I going to be able to keep my house if I go to arrest this person and something happens unexpectedly? No one wants to protect dirty cops. Certainly we don't. We don't want to paper over unlawful activity of cops. We just don't. That's not what we do. But we do want to make sure that when those cops are making that risk calculus or assessment, that they feel comfortable enough to do the right thing, no matter the outcome. No matter the outcome. So the outcome often drives the risk. You can do everything right as a cop, but if at the end of it, the person that you went to arrest has died or you had to use some level of force, it's the outcome that often drives the narrative and everything that follows. And it doesn't matter whether what you did was right or wrong. And that is really where the problem is. So Uvalde is an extreme example of what appeared to be inaction or insufficient action by law enforcement. And it appeared to be a very extreme case of that, by the way. What the actual facts are, we're not really sure. But, we can't have that. We can't have inaction or paralysis or overwhelming fear in the law enforcement community just to go do the right thing. We need cops to feel comfortable to do the right thing. And whether it's qualified immunity or just leadership support or whatever, that's what we need. And that's the bottom lines. We're going to have guests on that have firsthand expert knowledge of these things or have experienced these types of situations. We'll have law enforcement officers on who we have supported through their legal case and who can tell their story from their perspective, which fortunately, as an organization, we get to see it firsthand and we get to see the courage. We have cops that have been through the ringer legally, has destroyed their life. And the thing they tell me when it's over is the thing I'm most happy about is I get to put my uniform back on and go out there again and serve my community. And it probably sounds a little bit hokey, but it's the truth. And so we look forward to being able to continue to tell their stories and to discuss these issues as complex and nuanced as they are. So thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at our second episode. Please subscribe. And if you feel motivated, you can feel free to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us get the word out in support of law enforcement. And we'll catch you next time.